Hi. Can you see me? Sound on? Okay, so I guess, what time is it now? It might be early. I can't believe that. How did that happen? Yeah. I think I'm early. Having a baby, it sort of gets you up in the morning. Yeah, I think I was notoriously late, but now it's like 6:30. Yeah. Okay, I'll wait for another minute, and then I'll jump in. Well, what time is it on your clock? Because I've now got.
It's 11:01.
Okay. So today we're going to talk about cellars, Wilfrid cellars. We've got a bit of a dash, I think, through the rest of the semester. Next Tuesday, I'll talk about Tomasello just for an hour. It's a little taster. For those in psychology, you probably know him. For those in philosophy, I think it's someone who'd work. Now, who's heard of Tomasello? Read him before? Okay, so he's sort of fun. If you like, there were two things on the original syllabus. I'm just going to look at the shorter one. If you like it, I'd go and have a look at his other works, and I'll give you a little kind of crash course on Tomasello. And then on next Wednesday, I'll do the same with Ruth Milligan. And then after the Bayram, I've got two things. Maybe I'll do Susan Carey on the Tuesday after the Bayram. But I think Carey after Milligan. And then we've got the thing on Bayesianism and on predictive mind stuff. I think together that should work. So today you're getting a little kind of 2-hour crash course on Wilfrid cellars. And what I'm going to try and do is tell you a bit about Sellers' general project, and then I'll zoom in on the short excerpt we read from Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind. Who read the excerpt? Yeah, how did you find it? Hard. Yeah. Okay, so let's.
All facts said with this language is
Still here.
Yeah.
I think it's a very nice paper. It's been very influential, and I actually think the Putnam one is sort of horrible. Yeah, like it's very influential, but this one I think is very nice. There's lots of different things going on in it, and I think all the things going on in it, once you understand what the story is supposed to be, I think it's quite nice. And it basically is the origin of theory in psychology. Yeah, so Sellers was the son of a philosopher. So his father was Roy Wood Sellers, who I don't really know much about. He was the sort of one of the 1930s, who had a bunch of American philosophers who were known as critical realists. Ken Westphal, if any of you liked Roy Wood Sellers, I've never read him. Wilfrid Sellers, I think, is one of the more interesting American philosophers after the Second World War. He's sort of within the analytic tradition. I think, I mean, in some sense, he rejects a whole bunch of classical analytic stuff. So what we're going to be focusing on is this section from empiricism and the philosophy of mind. If you like Sellers, his other most kind of, I think, influential article is an article called Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man, where he makes a distinction between what he calls the manifest image and the scientific image. The manifest image is our sort of common sense self-conception. The scientific image is the kind of the perspective of science, maybe physics. And yeah, he thinks that the sort of big question in philosophy is how to put these images together. And at the beginning of this article, he has, I'm going to read you the first paragraph, because at the beginning he offers an account of what sort of philosophy is, his sort of vision of how philosophy works. And I was going to read it from my screen, but then I realized I'm zooming, so I had to write it down, and then I'm going to have to read my own handwriting, which may actually be impossible. I've never, yeah. So he says, the aim of philosophy, abstractly forming. Oh, before we come to the sentences, you asked if we were going to talk about.
No, I was just was trying to understand whether we finished talking
Okay.
about that paper.
Okay. If anyone had any questions, yeah, I've started now, but after the break, yeah, if anyone has questions about the last thing we read about the Hasson, then you can fire them away. So he says, the aim of philosophy abstract formulated is to understand how things in the broadest sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. Under things, so the aim of philosophy, according to Sellers, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things in the broadest sense of the term hang together in the broadest sense of the term. Under things in their broadest possible sense, I include some radically different items as not only cabbages and kings, but numbers and duties, possibilities and finger snaps, aesthetic experience and death. To achieve success in philosophy would be, to use a contemporary turn of phrase, to know one's way around with respect to all of these things. Not in that unreflexive way in which the centipede of the story knew its way around before it faced the question, how do I walk? But in that reflexive way, which means that no intellectual holes are barred. So I take it that his idea of what philosophy, the goal of philosophy, it's a sort of understanding how things fit together. It's a form of sort of reflexive orientation. It's sort of synoptic. It's taking a big picture. How do you think this made him a bit of a sort of odd man out in 1950s analytic philosophy? Any thoughts? Anyone know anything about the 1950s? You know, 2 cars, 1950s suburbia. Yeah, it's all very atomistic. Yeah, I take it the mainstream sort of analytic view is what you do in philosophy is you divide things up into smaller and smaller problems and deal with one sort of problem at a time. Yeah, so we have sort of analytic. Yeah, and analysis involves taking something big and dividing it into small bits, okay, into manageable chunks and analyzing them. You take things down into there. And I think analytic philosophy has this tendency to kind of over-specialize. Yeah, so you have people working on one problem. Oh, I'm working on knowledge. I'm working on injustice. I'm working on epistemic injustice, you know, like, but getting into smaller and smaller subfields. And in the 50s, it was, I think, you know, you found one concept and then you tried to give an analysis of that concept, sort of without thinking about how it fitted together with everything else. The analytic philosophy was very much against systematicity. Systematicity, that's what those Hegelians do. Systematicity like holistic thinking. That's not what we're into. What we're into is analysis. So I take it there was a sort of brand of analytic philosophy that was possibly dominant, that had this sort of analytic approach. Yeah, that wanted to divide problems up, keep them separate from each other. I think one thing about Sellers is he calls empiricism and the philosophy of mind it's sort of Hegelian meditations, and Hegel was a sort of swear word in Anglophone philosophy. You know, Hegel, that's who the enemy was. So in some sense, I think in many ways Sellers is a sort of paradigm analytic philosopher. In another sense, he really rejects a lot of this tradition in terms of his understanding of the task of philosophy, a form of reflexive orientation. It's sort of synthetic rather than analytic. It's interested in how things hang together. It's interested in offering a sort of big picture. Yeah, so one of the things about Sellers is he does try and offer a kind of unified account of all sorts of spheres. So he writes about philosophy of language, but also about ethics and action. And so he's a sort of interesting guy. He also was one of the few kind of major analytic philosophers who took the history of philosophy seriously. So I think a lot of, you had coming out of logical positivism, you had this idea that philosophy must be like a science. And in science, we make a distinction between the science and the history of science. Yeah, you know, like there's physics and then there's history of physics. And the history of physics isn't what a physicist does. Yeah, they're doing physics is something that doesn't involve the history of the science. Doing physics is ahistorical. Yeah, you're just interested in learning the contemporary stuff. And I think there was a sort of division of, there was many philosophers in the Anglophone philosophy in the 1950s had this idea that if philosophy is going to be like science, you need to distinguish between philosophy and the history of philosophy in the same way that sciences do. Then one thing that's interesting, I used to live in Russia and had lots of Russian friends and knew a bunch of Russian mathematicians. And in MKU, Moscow State University, which is the top, I think was the top place for maths in the world, I think has the most field medalists. Their undergraduate teaching is purely historical, or mainly historical. Yeah, you do the kind of history of maths. You know, the first semester you do the first 1,000 years, then you do 500 years, then you do 250 years, and then you do 100 years. You know, by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, yeah.
Also, I took syntax from the linguistics
department
last semester, and it was also very historical as well.
Yeah.
Like this theory develops initially, and then this was rejected, and kind of stuff, not very synchronic.
Yeah. So I think Sellers is someone who thinks that, and I think especially in philosophy, but also in many sciences, the history is important because understanding a theory doesn't, I mean, you might just have a purely mathematical theory, and then you can say, well, once you've got the math, you can forget. But I think for many types of theories, to understand the theory, you have to understand how it emerged out of other theories. Yeah, because the theory, depending on what sort of theory it is, I think especially in the special sciences, and I think within philosophy, within sort of philosophy of language, I think there was this idea you don't need to speak about metaphysics or you don't need to do the history, but within ethics of political philosophy, I think that within ethics and political philosophy, understanding the history is really important. And I think there it's sort of integral. If you want to understand political ideas, understanding the history of the emergence of these ideas, so freedom. Yeah, if you want to understand freedom, then looking at the history of the concept of freedom is quite important. Nietzsche says in the genealogy, what's it? Anything that has a history can't be defined. Yeah, and I think there's something right about that. So anyway, Sellers is someone who took the history of philosophy very seriously. He has a couple of books on Kant that are very influential, very difficult. So this is a nice paper. I've read you that one quote. just talking about his conception of what philosophy is. Empiricism and the philosophy of mind started off as a set of lectures. I think it was the Locke lectures. I'm not exactly sure. In London, it was one of these named lectures in the UK, and the subtitle of the lectures was "The Myth of the Given." Anyone heard of this expression before? The myth of the given. So, what's the Latin for given? Any idea? Latin for given. No one. Datum.
Data.
Yeah. And the plural of datum, data. Yeah. Now, in the 1930s, what were people into? Well, people like Russell were into sense data. You've got the data of the senses, what's given to the senses. And you had this sort of phenomenalist almost, foundationalism was the sort of dominant picture. That the idea was that in empiricism, that what's the foundation of knowledge? That which is given to the senses. So the foundation of knowledge that which is given to the senses. And what's given to the senses? Well, sense data. Yeah. And so, and how do we understand this sense data? Well, Russell thought that what's given to the senses. So I don't see the chair. Yeah, what I'm immediately aware of are sense data. So I'm aware of a bunch of kind of pixels. We can think of the sense data is going to be a kind of set of colored pictures, a set of colored pixels. That's what the sense data is. And then somehow the sense data is going to be, you might think something like sensations. Yeah. And sensations, when in vision, you might think of something like colored pixels. In my history of philosophy class, my sort of post-Kantian philosophy, today we're going to be talking about Russell's chapter of his problems in philosophy on knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. Yeah. So Russell thinks that what we're acquainted with are sense data, pixels, and then our knowledge of objects of the external world isn't knowledge by acquaintance. We're not acquainted with the chair, but we have a description of it. And the description is going to be something like the cause of there's some physical object out there that's causing me to have the sensations that I'm having. What I'm immediately aware of are my sensations. And then, in some sense, I know physical objects in the external world through description. And it turns out that when you go this route, it comes with process. To make any sense of it, you don't have to you don't just have to know sense data, but you have to know immediately by acquaintance universals. So you need to be immediately acquainted with sense data and also abstract objects. And then he was pushing even further and said, oh, you also have to be acquainted with logical form. Yeah, if you push this, you get to the present. This is what Wittgenstein's sort of reacting to in the Tractatus. Yeah. But the foundation of empirical knowledge is sense data. What we experience are sense data. And in empiricism and the philosophy of mind, that he's really interested in two things. Yeah. That what should an empiricist or what should we make of sensations and thoughts? Sensations are going to be things like, well, yeah, what are they? Thoughts, you might think, beliefs. And he starts off by attacking the idea that what's immediately given are sensations. Yeah, so the sense data theorists think that what's immediately given are sensations, and then we somehow construct or define, logically construct the objects. Yeah, objects are thought of as not things that we know. And so the beginning of empiricism and the philosophy of mind, that one way of thinking about sensation is in terms of understanding the relationship between seems talk and is talk. Yeah. So the standard sort of view, if you apply it to the myth of the given, is that seems talk, if you're into the myth of the given, seems talk is foundational. So one thing about sense data for Russell and for the people who followed Russell is sense data are completely transparent. Yeah, that to be acquainted with something in this sense of immediate knowledge, so knowledge by acquaintance, is to be fully acquainted. Yeah, sense data don't have any behinds. Yeah, if you have acquaintance with a sensation, you know it fully. It's not like there's a backside that kind of is hidden. There's no hidden, yeah, there are no shadows. Yeah. So what's given is you know, in subjective experience, is you know, something seems red, and the seeming red, that's what's given to immediate acquaintance. Yeah. And then you can ask the question, is it red? Yeah. So according to the sort of myth of the given, that the way things seem is prior to the way they are. We're acquainted with how things seem, and then we sort of infer the way things are on the basis of what they seem. That's the sort of indirect realist view. This is the view that you've got the external world, it causes sensations in us or ideas, what we're immediately aware of are our ideas, and then we sort of infer the way things are from the way they appear to us. And Sellers, following Hegel, wants to argue that this doesn't make any sense. That in some sense, being aware of the way things are is prior to the capacity to think about the way things seem to be. Yeah. So Sellers, I think, is in the tradition of the British realist school. So going back to Thomas Reid, there's a sort of realist tradition that goes through. It's a sort of dominant view in America and France in the 19th century. Victor Cousin was one of the main things in France. I think kind of people like Bergson were very much influenced by Reid and Husserl. But anyway, there's this sort of realist tradition that then went through Oxford in the people like Wilson, Pritchard, Price in the 1930s. I think J.L. Austin then is coming out of this tradition in the 50s. And I think Tim Williamson now is sort of part of that Oxford realist tradition. That's a sort of long tradition. And I think that Sellers is coming from this realist tradition that thinks that is talk is prior to seems talk. That in some sense that we, first of all, our experience is objective, and that becoming aware of the way things seem to us, that's not the starting point of experience, but that's sort of achievement. To make the distinction between the way things are and the way things seem, yeah, is something that we have to learn. And it's something we can only learn given a kind of basic objective orientation. This is something I think that you also find in Kant. So once again, if you've taken the class with Ken, and he's talked about Kant, he probably has, and he's probably said stuff like this. Yeah. So when it comes to sensations, the first half of the book, a lot of it really is thinking about sensations and the relationship between how things are and how they seem to be, and it's how something seems to account how something looks. Yeah. If you say something looks red, yeah, it seems that when you say something looks red, what you're doing is you're saying you're having a red sensation. Yeah, so the sort of idea is that using the word of looks and seems to be the only way we can make sense of it is by appealing to, oh, I'm having a red sensation. Yeah. So it looks like in order to make sense of looks talks and seems talks, we appeal to this idea of sensations or of sense data. Yeah. And the first half of the book is sort of rejecting this sort of picture. Now, what time is it now? Okay, so he wants to reject the idea that sensations understood in terms of sense data are immediately given to consciousness. Yeah. He also wants to say something similar for beliefs. So neither sensation and nor beliefs are sense data. Now, when it comes to beliefs, I think that so let's have a look. Let's jump into the selection I gave you about the myth of Jones from empiricism and the philosophy of mind. So I take it when he was writing, this is the 1950s, what sort of view was dominant when it came to understanding what thoughts were?
Your verbal thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of dominant view was some form of behaviorism. Yeah, that we understood thoughts in terms of
Disposition to behavior.
yeah. So I think he thinks there's a bunch of views out there. You've got a dispositional view. He wants to defend in a certain way what he calls the classical view. Yeah, and the classical view is a view that takes thought to be something given. So he wants to defend something like the Cartesian view, whilst rejecting the idea that thoughts are something that are given to us in the sense that we're acquainted with them. So you might think you might think he used Russell's terminology. Yeah, that if you're a Cartesian, then you think the thoughts of these inner episodes that you're sort of acquainted with. You have this immediate acquaintance with your own thoughts. Yeah, so the relation you have to your own thoughts, your own beliefs, is one of knowledge by acquaintance. Yeah, the thoughts are given to you. And Seller's sort of project, Seller's sort of picture is to accept something close to the Cartesian position, but getting rid of the idea of acquaintance. So you have the idea that thoughts are inner episodes, they're not dispositions, they're not necessarily tied to unexpressed speech. Yeah, so they can have causal powers. So basically the project is to offer an account of thoughts or beliefs. When he talks about thoughts, I think that his beliefs just as good. So according to the classical tradition, he says, now the classical conditions is on page, I'm here, yeah. So the classical condition claimed that there is a family of episodes, neither overt verbal behavior nor verbal imagery, which are thoughts. And that both overt verbal behavior and verbal imagery owe their meaningfulness to the fact that they stand to these thoughts in the unique relations of expressing them. So language, thought, there is a relation between thought and language, expression. And when I utter something, I'm expressing a thought. Yeah. These episodes are introspectable. So these are episodes that we can know through introspection. And it was usually believed that they could not occur without being known to occur. So the thing about thoughts, according to the classical tradition, that thoughts, in some sense, are prior to language, you might think, that meaningful language expresses thought. Sorry, I needed more space. So we have this expression relation. And the thoughts are introspectable, and they cannot occur without being known. Now, I think Sellers wants to keep something like this. The thoughts are in some sense prior to language, at least metaphysically. In terms of the order of being, they're prior to language. In terms of the order of knowing, I think language is prior to thought, that we can only know our thoughts if we have language. So knowing thoughts is dependent on language. According to the Cartesian, thoughts are introspectable and they can't occur without being known. Well, Sellers is going to reject this, the claim that thoughts are, in a sense, luminous. Yeah, the sort of Cartesians committed to the idea that thoughts are sort of self-revealing. They light themselves. That you can't help but see them when you have them. Introspectable. I think Sellers is going to say, well, they're not really introspectable, but that he's going to, you're going to have an analog of introspectability, yeah, that captures, I think, that they're reportable. Yeah, they're self-reportable. So our thoughts are something that we're able to report. Yeah, so I'm able to tell you what my thoughts are. Yeah? And I think that the introspectability, I think Sarah sort of thinks, and we do have a sort of privileged self-reporting. So self-reporting, reporting our own thoughts, is something that we can do in a way that other people can't do. Yeah, so there is a sort of privileged first-person perspective, but not in terms of something like a sort of seeing, but in terms of a sort of capacity to report. Yeah, so Tanis wants to offer a sort of defense of a semi-Cartesian view, some sense closer to Descartes, sort of against, you might think, against behaviorists. Yeah. And I think he thinks that the problem with the Cartesian view is that he says, well, it was usually believed that they could not occur without being known to occur. But this can be traced to a number of confusions, perhaps the most important of which was the idea that thoughts belong in the same general category as sensations, images, tickles, itches, etc. This misassimilation of thoughts to sensations and feelings was equally, as we saw above, a misassimilation of sensations and feelings to thoughts and a falsification of both. The assumption that if there are thought episodes, they must be immediate experiences is common both to those who propound the classical view and to those who reject it, saying that they find no such experiences. If we purge the classical tradition of these confusions, it becomes the idea that this is the purged, cleaned up version of the classical tradition that Sellers wanted to defend. It comes to the idea that to each of us belongs a stream of episodes, not themselves immediate experiences, to which we have privileged, but by no means either invariable or infallible access. These episodes can occur without being expressed by overt verbal behavior, though verbal behavior is, in an important sense, their natural fruition. And this is the view he wants to defend. So there's a sort of modified, a cleaned up classical view of thoughts. Yeah. They're not, we have thoughts, that these thoughts are inner episodes, but they're not immediate experiences. Yeah. And we have some sort of privileged access. Yeah. And he wants to say that these episodes, so one sort of thought amongst people say influenced by Ryle is we have outer speech, and then we have inner speech where we have a bunch of inner verbal imagery. We might assimilate inner speech to or thought to inner speech, which is basically the outer speech but not expressed. And Sellers doesn't want to do that. Yeah. He says we can hear ourselves think if we're having an inner monologue when we're talking to ourselves, but the verbal imagery which enables us to do this is no more thinking itself than is the overt behavior by which it is expressed and communicated to others. Yeah, so he wants to separate the idea of thought, these internal states, from verbal imagery. So that often when we're thinking, there's some verbal imagery accompanying our thoughts, but this is sort of accidental. This is not an essential aspect of what it is to think. And we don't have to think it. There's a sort of, there's thought going on, even if there's no imagery. Now,
by imagery, does it mean like linguistic, like word images, or
so so I don't know how this works exactly. I'm sort of aphantastic, so I don't have visual or auditory imagery. But I think for you guys, like when you think, if you're thinking something through, do you have any sort of auditory experience?
kind of like, but there's a thing called semantic memory,
Yeah.
which I think can be like, it's neither personal, it's not visual, it's not poetry. They may have associations with it, but they're in itself non-perceptual. They're linguistic, I think.
Yeah. So my sort of, I mean, I think people talk about the phonological loop, that if you're remembering a phone number, you've got it in your, so I sort of do that sort of memory thing with motor imagery. I imagine saying it, and I kind of, there is some motor imagery there, but yeah, I think there's some sort of inner processes where you have some sort of imagery, and I take it, I mean, I think imagery is very difficult to, so we might think, well, you've got conceptual stuff, and then you've got the kind of sensory stuff. I think there's this sort of idea that, well, we can understand the distinction between the kind of, between the conceptual and the sensory. Yeah, so we make a distinction between the conceptual and the sensory. And then we think that the sensory is in some sense all imagistic. Now, it's not obvious to me this is true. Yeah. As a direct realist, I think you just see the object. Yeah, and does vision involve imagery? I think the sort of standard view is that sensations all involve something like sensations. There's also imagery involved. And then to say that thinking doesn't essentially involve imagery is to say, well, you have sensation, then you've got a distinction between thinking, between the conceptual and the non-conceptual, between the sort of conceptual part of the brain and the sensory part. And yeah, and then you've got some stuff that can go on here that doesn't involve any of this sensory stuff. I think it's very difficult. One of the big areas in the last kind of 20 years in the philosophy of conception has been about conceptual content and to what degree there's non-conceptual content in experience and what that means. And it turns out it's very difficult to explain exactly what we mean about the distinction between the kind of thought and imagery. Yeah, that makes something imagistic. And one thing is that there's also a bunch of people who are into the idea of cognitive phenomenology. Yeah, so people like Galen Strawson, he sort of defends this. Michel Montague. Yeah, that there is a sort of a phenomenology to thinking, but it's not imagistic. So there's something like what it is to have a thought. Yeah, but it's not imagistic. So I mean, I think it's quite difficult to kind of really hash out what this distinction comes down to. But I take it the idea is that, well, we've got these different sensory modalities. We've got vision, we've got audition, and then we've got thought, and thought is kind of goes on in a way that is not dependent on any particular sensory modality of the kind of the sort of representations of that modality. So when we're thinking, yeah, beliefs don't have, when you have a belief, it's not like, oh, is it an auditory expressed belief or a visually? Is it content, or is it an auditory belief or a visual belief? And then the sort of thought is, no. Beliefs and thoughts are supposed to be amodal. I think one way of thinking about this stuff about imagery is in terms of the thoughts are sort of amodal. They have some sort of representations, but they're not representations that belong to a specific modality. Yeah, so this is the position that he wants to the idea is that we can have these thoughts, that we do, in a sense, have privileged access to them. But these thoughts are not objects of immediate experience. Yeah? So our own beliefs are not objects of immediate experience, but that we have this privileged access to the story he wants to tell. How long have we got now? Okay, so what's his answer? Did anyone read far enough to get his answer? Intentions?
I think it's connecting everything like intention.
Well, no, yeah, I think you're wrong there. Maybe you didn't get far enough. So thought, belief. Belief is like DNA or virus or atom. So the first claim is that our concept of belief is a sort of theoretical term. The concept of a belief is introduced as part of a theory. Yeah, and so we have so it's got the same sort of status as DNA, virus, and atom. This is the sense in which Sellers is the sort of foundation of theory. Yeah, that we have the concept of belief is a theory. We have a theoretical entity. Now, you might think, well, there are two types of things. Actual entities, well, and theoretical things. So you might have a sort of instrumentalism about science. This was the sort of popular view in so you might think that, well, there's two types of language. There's the language of observation, the language of theory. Sellers is committed to this, that there can be many distinctions between observational terms and theoretical terms. But then he thinks that often when we make this distinction, we make this into a sort of metaphysical distinction between two types of objects. Observables, and maybe kind of theoretical and Sellers wants to reject this sort of metaphysical move. So Sellers is a scientific realist in general. So he thinks that whether or not something is an observational term or a theoretical term doesn't tell us anything about the status of the object referred to. Yeah. And secondly, he thinks that things that start off as theoretical terms, things that start off introduced purely theoretically, are things that we can later on learn to observe. Yeah. So the fact that something is introduced as part of the theory, as a theoretical term, doesn't mean that we can't then later go on and learn how to observe it. So you might think about genes. Yeah, the genes, not these DNA. Genes was introduced in theoretical terms. There's got to be something there that plays this role. So Mendel had the idea of genes, but they didn't know what it was. And then kind of we came up with the DNA hypothesis, and now we can observe bits of DNA. That people were wondering about disease, and it's not interesting. The first kind of theory of disease was that disease is something that came from outside and sort of infected you. And there's some bats, and the Greeks, this was kind of, I think, pre-Hellenistic. And then the sort of sophisticated Greeks were like, oh no, that's so old-fashioned, superstitious. Disease is, we've got these humors, and disease is always kind of imbalance in the body. And then, yeah, and so there are these big debates about whether disease is a matter of some sort of imbalance or whether it's some infection from outside. And people came up with theories of infection and how infection works. And now today that we know that many diseases, we have viruses, we have bacteria, then that before we could observe viruses and bacteria with microscopes, some people posited the existence of small particles. No, there's something small in the water that is causing this. And this was introduced as a hypothesis. And then with microscopes, we learn how to observe the bacteria. Yeah. So the fact that something is introduced in theoretical terms doesn't mean that we can't later learn to identify it. Yeah. Now, Sellers is going to tell a story that, so beliefs are, the concept of belief is introduced in theoretical terms to kind of explain and predict behavior. Yeah. And once we've got this concept, we can then learn to express our own beliefs. Yeah. And the way we express our own beliefs is, and our relationship to our own beliefs, once we have the concept of belief, can be different from the relationship to other people's beliefs. Yeah. That it's not like we can immediately perceive them, but we have a sort of privileged reporting role. We're able to report our own beliefs. So this is the sort of story he wants to tell, and I think the way he tells it is quite nice. And then he was okay, yeah. So let's have a 10-minute break, and then we'll work through the paper. I think he's a bit difficult to read, but I think once you understand it, it's quite clear. Isn't that always the case? Maybe. Here?
Without bothering you.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I can't see my. Oh no, we've still got another couple of minutes. I'm so too excited today. It's starting early. Okay. You get started? Are the smokers still outside? Yeah, lots of smokers. Okay, so Sellers is interested in the question of how. I mean, what do you think of the question? Well, there's a number of questions. The first question I think that Sellers wants to ask is how could a group of animals that had no concept of belief acquire such a concept? Now, and Sellers, I think today many people in psychology are sort of nativists, and they think that in some sense we have a sort of innate concept of belief. We have a sort of belief attribution model. I think this is something that Sellers is going to reject. That Sellers' answer to this question is, well, the story about how we come to have concept is going to be in terms of language. So to answer this question, he thinks that we answer this question is how could the concept belief be introduced into a language? Yeah, so to answer this question, the sort of answer is going to be linguistic, which means today in psychology, I think many people in psychology have the idea that we've evolved. So how, I think the sort of thought is chimps don't have a concept of belief, we do. Yeah, so how did we move from being apes like chimpanzees to being human beings that have notions of beliefs, who have sort of, that having notions of belief allows us to be self-conscious reflexively. And without this concept of belief, without being able to think about our own beliefs, we lack this sort of capacity for reflection. And Sellers' idea is that coming to have the concept of belief is something we can only get through language. This is one of, I think, the big debates now in psychology, is to what degree is theory of mind or mind reading dependent on language. So I think Sellers is committed to the idea that mind reading is requires language. Requires.
We take that they don't have this concept of belief
Yeah.
over which they act. No,
What's that?
they don't have this concept of belief.
Yeah.
We believe so.
Yeah, I think this is. I mean,
language as like human language, or like the extent others understanding of language to like the communication types and stuff.
so I take it the sort of thought is that mind reading requires public language. That one of my MA students who's just finishing up in Cog Sci, Berke, he was working with this woman Rabia, who works with deaf people. So she's got family in near Mersin who you have lots of people who are deaf, they're cut off from other signers, so they've invented their own language. So I think that the theory is that mind reading requires a public language. But this public language doesn't have to be a vocal one. So Tomasello, for example, he thinks he's got a nice book. What's it called? On the origin of human, is it called communication? I think it's called. And he thinks that the emergence of public language started off with sign language, not with vocalization. And so the origin of language is in chimpanzee gestures. And I think I'm very sympathetic to a view like this. So I don't think it requires a spoken language. Yeah. So how could he thinks this question? How could a group of animals that have no concept of belief acquire such a concept? He rejects the nativist view, where we've evolved into animals that have a mind-reading module. Yeah. So there's a sort of evolutionary story that it's just we develop a mind-reading module, and so we move from animals that don't have any concept of belief to animals that have an innate belief concept. So he sort of rejects nativism, that we've just evolved into beings with an innate concept of belief. I think nativism is just, you don't explain what is the concept, how do you acquire it, I think these sort of nativist answers are a bit magical. That one thing you might think is what's involved in having a concept. You might think that we might evolve to be able to track certain things without necessarily having a concept of it. So we may acquire sensitivities to certain things without that concept. It's a complicated issue. So how could the concept of belief be introduced into language? Now that's one question. Now the other question is, are there beliefs? Yeah, so we've got the question of, and Seller's view is that the concept of belief is introduced in language as part of a theory. And then the question, are there beliefs, comes down to the question, is it a good theory? And the answer he thinks is yes, it's a perfectly good theory. And therefore we've got, as in general, Sellers is a scientific realist. And if you're a scientific realist, in general, if you've got a theoretical term that's introduced as part of a well-functioning theory, then you tend to believe in the objects of your theory. So Sellers is introduced in language as part of the theory. And the theory is good. A good one. And I'm a realist. I'm a scientific. Therefore, I believe that there are beliefs. I have good reasons to think that there really are beliefs. Yeah, that's basically the picture. One of his students, Paul Churchland, he was quite big in the sort of 80s, 90s. He was a defender of, anyone heard of Churchland? Patricia? his wife, they're both kind of West Coast, Coxeye.
I've heard about this also.
Oh yeah, yeah. They're both. I mean, they're both kind of well known. I mean, they defend what's known as illimitivist materialism. So Churchland was a student of Sellers, and he's like, I agree with you. Yeah, the notion of belief is part of a theory. It's part of what we call folk psychology. So these people coming out of Sellers, these students, yeah, are then going to say, well, what the theory is folk psychology. Yeah, so the concept of belief is introduced as part of the theory. Let's call this theory folk psychology. It's the theory that explains and predicts actions in terms of beliefs and desires. So Churchland says, yes, Sellers is completely right, but it's just a really bad theory. It's just a false theory, and we should get rid of it and replace it with neuroscience. Because neuroscience is such an advanced, serious theory that you say, hold on a minute. We have correlations between, yeah, I mean, neuroscience at the moment, I think the promise we know that hasn't really, yeah, I think it's still at its very basic stages. Yeah, so we're going to focus on this one. Yeah, so the question of whether there really are beliefs, I think Sellers just thinks, well, we've got this theory, and in general, if we have a good theory, if we have a workable theory, then we tend to believe in the theoretical entity as positive by theory. And also, given the fact that we can learn to report our own beliefs, yeah, that in some sense our own beliefs do become sort of observable to us, because learning to report our beliefs, this is a sort of privileged access, and we are able to kind of tell people what our beliefs are, not 100% accuracy, sometimes make mistakes. In general, we're quite good at it. So how could a group of animals that had no concept of belief, why such a concept? How could the concept belief be introduced into a language that didn't have the concept? How could you go from a group of chimpanzees, a group of apes that have no self-consciousness, no understanding of themselves as animals with thoughts, to self-consciousness? Yeah? Self-consciousness involves being able to represent one's own representation. It's got to do with being able to to think about one's own thoughts. Yeah. So in order to think about one's own thoughts, it needs some grasp of having thoughts. So you might think the question he's interested in is how is self-consciousness possible? And I think he thinks that self-consciousness requires public language. Yeah.
I don't think there's a difference between self-consciousness and metaconsciousness.
Okay, so yeah, so I mean, there's a certain type of within psychology. Often it's like, oh, self-consciousness is does this animal pass the mirror test? You know the mirror test where you put a little some shit on something's face and then it looks in the mirror and that, oh, if it wipes it off, you're like, oh, it's recognized itself in the mirror. There's a sort of, you might think, yeah, that's one sort of able to recognize oneself in the mirror. I think, yeah, when I'm just going to stipulate. Yeah, often we do this in philosophy. It's like, well, this word self-consciousness, it could mean hundreds of different things, but there's a perfectly good use of self-consciousness that we might think of in cognitive terms as sort of the capacity for reflexive thought. Yeah, so, you know, and you might think that, so you've got this notion of metacognition in psychology, which has got to do with, I mean, a lot of people, when they talk about metacognition, it's got to do with some kind of monitoring system where you're kind of monitoring how accurate your kind of beliefs are. So it's got to do with, and it's not obvious that that requires reflexive thought. So I think one thing about self-consciousness, metacognition, people use these expressions in really different ways. And there's a whole bunch of distinct phenomena that may be related to each other in various ways. So yeah, so there's one notion of self-consciousness, which is just, you know, reflexive thought, the capacity to think about one's own thoughts. Yeah. Yep.
I was going to ask Why
Yeah.
you say you go from conscious to subconscious, but not from attention being able to pay attention to consciousness in general?
I mean, so one thing is that I think partly my answer to your question is going to be, it's just, I think it's a matter of stipulating how we're going to use words here. Because I think all of these words are used in many different ways. Yeah.
Consciousness and subconsciousness describes the different mechanisms, so that you can't have consciousness without it being directly told to you. But I think if it's consciousness is a sort of like a process, its object, why does it matter whether it's direct towards me or towards the world?
Yeah. So you can have yeah. So maybe I mean, there's one sense of self-consciousness that I take it is going to be having to do with reflexive thought. I think you could have a kind of so you might have a sensory version, but I think animals are conscious of the world. And I think that there's a certain self-consciousness involved in that, so that there is some reflexivity in animal perception, yeah, without there being this sort of reflexive self-consciousness, yeah. So I think that, yeah. So I think so when we're seeing something, when I'm seeing something, I'm aware that I'm seeing it, yeah, and so that I'm aware of the chair, but at the same time, I'm aware of my seeing the chair. Yeah, so there's this is once again something. Yeah. Russell says, well, I'm acquainted with sense data, but also I'm acquainted with acquaintance. Yeah. And self-consciousness is an acquaintance with acquaintance. And actually acquaintance is complex that involves the I, the relation, and the object. So that being acquainted with this acquaintance involves, in some sense, being acquainted with the I, the object, and the relation. Yeah. And I think there's something right about that. You might think that all perception involves something like acquaintance. And maybe all perception involves something like acquaintance with the acquaintance. And even animals have that. Some people think, though, that this sort of acquaintance with acquaintance is something that only goes with language. Now, I want to remain neutral on that. I think that's not really relevant for the things I'm interested in here. But I think there's a certain type of self-consciousness, I think, yeah, that does have, that is more kind of cognitive, that has got to do with the capacity to reflect on our own thoughts. And that sort of reflection, I think, requires some sort of concept of something like the concept of belief or the concept of thought. I've got to recognize my own thoughts as thoughts. Yeah. And so, and I think this sort of reflexive self-consciousness is not the same as metacognition, which is a sort of monitoring of, I think often the literature I know on metacognition in psychology, you have this idea that you have these sort of credences that have a sort of value. So you know, yeah, and then the question is how confident are you in your own credences? So it's a sort of monitoring of the reliability of your lower level processing. So you have certain sort of processes, and then you have some sort of higher level monitoring of how reliable these processes are. And so this sort of metacognition posited by how often it's used in psychology is a sort of monitoring of the accuracy. A judgment involves sort of judgment of the accuracy of lower level processes. Yeah, so you saw something out the corner of your eye and you think it's a gun. How confident are you that that's a gun? Yeah, and so often this research in metacognition involves asking people like, oh, something happens, how confident are you? Then you work out what our confidence is based on, how reliable our judgments of confidence are, and the like. And I'm not sure what that's got to do with the capacity to think about our own thoughts, because I think that maybe animals can have that without this kind of reflexive capacity. So monitoring the accuracy of lower level processes is actually something that can be going on stuff personally, yeah, without really any capacity for thinking about one's own thoughts. Yeah. Yeah. Some people though think that the capacity for reflexive thought makes a whole bunch of lower level stuff possible. So some people might, I think some people, like someone like McDowell, so in terms of the people influenced by Sellers, I think two of the most important people are Robert Brandon. Yeah, who's really cool. He sort of defends what's known as inferentialism. He's got a recent book just out on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. He's been working on for about 30 years. He does quite a lot of kind of hardcore logic, but then also Hegel. He's sort of fun. Then you've got this guy, John McDowell. And he had a very influential series of lectures in 1989, I think something like that, Mind and World. Yeah, he sort of is channeling. And McDowell thinks that animal perception and human perception are just radically different because animals are not self-conscious in this sense. Yeah, so yeah, animal perception is really quite different from human perception because this capacity for reflection and justification radically changes the nature of our perception. So for us, perception is conceptual and having concepts. So one thing is that McDowell thinks that having concepts is only possible if you've got some sort of reflection. Yeah, so animals don't really have concepts. They just are sensitive to the world, they respond to it. But concepts involve the capacity of judgment, of inference. And to engage in inferences and judgment, you've got to be able to reflect on your own thoughts. Yeah, so you might think that reflexive thought is going to be necessary in terms of having concepts. Yeah, some sort of reflection. Okay, so what's the story he tells? What time is it now? Okay, so how could the concept of belief be reduced into a language? How could the term? Yeah, so how could the term belief be introduced into language of a group of animals that didn't have it? Yeah, when I say term, because this is a linguistic term, and then if you think that concepts require reflection, and reflection requires across the beliefs, then you might think, well, first of all, we introduce the term belief into our language, and then once we've got the term belief into our language, we're able to reflect on our own beliefs. And it's only once we're able to reflect on our own beliefs that we acquire conceptual capacities, because in order to have concepts, we have to be able to engage in inferences. And to engage in an inference involves not just having beliefs, but representing beliefs. Yeah, because inferences involve recognizing inferential relations between beliefs. And this is a sort of McDowell picture as I see it. Maybe Brandon also goes in that direction. Yeah, so how could a bunch of animals that don't have the term belief introduce the term belief into their language? And so the first thing he starts, well, let's start off by thinking about what they'd require in their language and language. So we've got section 12 is on our Rileyan ancestors. So our Rileyan ancestors are a bunch of apes who have some language, acquired some language, but don't have any terms in their language for mental states or for beliefs. They might have pain language, but that's irrelevant. Yeah. So imagine a stage in prehistory in which humans are limited to what I should call a Rileyan language. A Rileyan language is a fundamental descriptive vocabulary, speaks of public properties of public objects located in space and enduring through time. So you've got this basic language, a bunch of animals who develop a language, and this language, contained in this language are words for publicly observable things. Yeah, so, you know, when we come to Tomasello, think about going hunting. Language developed some sort of basic sign language to refer to things in the world, also to give instruction about how people move. Now, and he says this, I'm not going to talk about how language is possible, that's another question. Let's imagine language is developed, but it hasn't developed any mentalistic path. What would need to be added to this language to get us to the stage where we could have a concept or a term, an understanding of belief? So first of all, we have this Rileyan language. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the things this language would require. I'm just going to focus on the most important one. But first of all, that we have a fundamentally descriptive vocabulary. Speaking of public properties, of public objects. Now, what else do we have to add to this language, does he think? What other bits of what other resources would need to be added to this language? Okay, yeah, we've got some stuff about conditionals. I guess this subjunctive stuff is stuff about causation, causal language, laws, use some notion of causation and laws. What's the next thing he talks about in section 535? Or page 535? Well, we're going to need some sort of predicate. Yeah, we're going to need some sort of semantic discourse. So these people are going to be able to talk about the world. And so these animals start talking to each other. They start communicating. And after some time, one of the things now in their public world is language. Yeah, so these animals are talking to one another, and they've developed a basic language to go hunting with, describe things. Maybe that one hypothesis is that the most important motivation for language wasn't hunting, but gossip. Yeah, so that, and gossip plays an important role in sort of monitoring group norms. So to have a group of animals that have basically self-domesticated, that being able to monitor whether others are doing their share is going to be important. And so once language is started, at some point, these animals that have language, they can talk about things in the world. But one of the things now in the public sphere is language itself. So one thing is that they've got a language that is fundamentally descriptive to talk about public things, but the language use itself becomes public. So part of their language is going to be a capacity to talk about language. Now, so they're going to develop a sort of vocabulary to talk about public language. And part of this public vocabulary is going to be semantic. No? So we can see how animals could learn some sort of semantic vocabulary. I'm gossiping about Eunice, I don't know, and he's not here, so I'm going to tell you a bunch of stuff, a bunch of shit. You're going to say, no, that's not true. Yeah. So being able to kind of deny the truth of what people are saying might be quite important. Yeah, so someone says something and you might say, no, that's not true. So you might think that we can understand how these sort of notions could evolve. If we're thinking about the origin of language, we can think how semantic notion could evolve amongst a group of a community of apes that have started to have a language, and then they can start talking about language. And in particular, I think one of the most important things, they're going to want to be able to say, to deny the claims of others, to say that's false, or I agree. And someone says something, you're not, yeah, and someone else, and I think whenever you've got a language community, when you've got members of the community who say things that are opposed to each other, then you're going to have to start thinking about who to believe, which one's true. So the idea is that maybe we can understand in non-mysterious terms how how not only could we have a language to talk about tables and shares and gossip, but also a language to talk about language. And we're going to say that's true, that's false. We come to, once we've got this language, we've got a language to talk about representations. So when we say this is false, we mean it sort of misrepresents. Yeah. So once we've got this language, we've acquired a basic grasp of intentionality, the intentionality of language. Yeah. You're saying something, and by saying it's false, we're saying that what you said doesn't match reality. And to get this use of language is going to involve grasping, having some basic grasp of sort of intentional notions. Now, what time is it now? 23. Okay, yeah. So now there's some other stuff as well. Let's suppose that we also come up with an understanding of causal regularities in nature. So we come to some language about what's likely to happen once something else has happened. So we develop a certain kind of causal language, some idea of laws. Yeah, we predict things in nature through. This is the sort of stuff about subjective, conditional. Let's suppose you've got these animals that are able to, and this sort of stuff is a bunch of language that is going to be necessary for theory construction. Yeah, so we're able to kind of come up with theories about the public world with some notion of causation. We might think, how could we have an understanding of causation? Ask Hume, ask Kant, is the big question. But let's suppose you've got language with all this stuff in, but without any notion of belief. Then I think, how could we come up with a notion of belief? Well, now one thing is we might want to think about is that the essence of belief, what beliefs are, and what's mysterious about beliefs, in some sense, is that they're intentional states. They're states that have an aboutness. Yeah, beliefs are things that have a semantic quality. And one thing about if we've got a language to talk about language, yeah, then in some sense, a language to talk about language is going to contain a bunch of the stuff that's required to think about beliefs. And he says, this is on page 536. For characteristics of thoughts is their intentionality, reference, or aboutness. And it is clear that semantical talk about the meaning or reference of verbal expressions has the same structure as mentalistic discourse concerning what thoughts are about. Yeah. Now, and the classical view has been that the idea that not only are there overt verbal episodes which can be characterized in semantic terms, but over and above these, there are certain inner episodes which are properly characterized by the traditional vocabularies of intentionality. The one thing about the classical view he wants to defend is that we have these inner episodes that are characterized by the traditional vocabulary of intentionality. But this vocabulary of intentionality is a vocabulary that we get just through understanding language. Yeah? So how do we then get from talking about language to talking about thought? Well, Sellers has a story to tell. It's called The Myth of Joe. Now, in order to tell this story, then he has a brief digression about the philosophy of science. So section 13 is a digression about the philosophy of science. And here we have what is a theory. What is a scientific theory? Now, he's writing in the background of logical positivism, and the logical positivists have a very sort of castrated view of what a theory is. Yeah, it's a view of theory that's sort of lifeless. Yeah, and this is the view of a theory. So he says he's going to need to make a distinction between the language of theory and the language of observation. Now, he says at the top, he says informally, to construct a theory, this is the logical positivist view of a theory that he's going to sort of question. He's going to say this is just too abstract. This is not how theory construction really works. Informally, to construct a theory is in its most developed and sophisticated form to postulate a domain of entities which behave in certain ways set down by the fundamental principles of the theory, and to correlate, perhaps in a certain sense, to identify complexes of these theoretical entities with certain non-theoretical objects or situations. And we've got something observable, then we come up with a theory. Theory we can think of in terms of a set of laws that govern the relation between these postulated entities. And then somehow we can either identify or connect the kind of posited entities of the theories with the observable entities of everyday life. So heat is kinetic energy. Yeah, you might think, well, we've got these particles, we've got laws. Now, this view of what theory is, that really what's central to theory is the introduction of law-governed behavior. And all we really need for a theory is a set of laws. This is a view that he says it, constructive theory is most developed or sophisticated form of this. This is something that in some sense he's going to reject as an account of scientific practice. Yeah, so Sellers is an important philosopher of science. In his work on the philosophy of science, most of people in the 50s, Anglophone, were kind of instrumentalists, anti-realists. Sellers is one of the kind of major realists about scientific theories. And he thinks, and he's also concerned with scientific practice. So he says, listen, this is a highly artificial and unrealistic picture of what scientists have actually done in the process of construction of theory. And in particular, it misses out the importance in theories of models. Yeah. So normally, when we construct a theory, we construct the theory by appeal to some sort of model. Yeah. And a model is something that we already are acquainted with. So a model is something observable. And we use this model as a way as a model of something that's not observable. So if you're an atomist, you might think, oh, atoms are basically little billiard balls bouncing around, little balls. We've got this model of what's going on. You know, the model of the atom as a sort of like the solar system. You've got something that you already know, and you use that as a sort of model for something unknown. And so he says the first rejection of this kind of logical positivist view of how science works. The first is that the fundamental assumptions of a theory are usually developed not by constructing uninterpreted calculi, which might correlate in the desired manner with observable discourse, but rather by attempting to find a model. Yeah? I.e., to describe a domain of familiar objects behaving in familiar ways, such that we can see how the phenomena to be explained would arise if they consisted of this sort of thing. So we've got something we already understand, And then we use that as a model for that which we don't understand. Yeah, and so models play a central role in theory construction. Now, once we've got this idea that theories work by having models, and we take something observable and we use this as a model for something unobservable, for our postulated theoretical entities are modeled on something we are observing, then we can think how we could go from a language like this to a language which has beliefs introduced as a sort of theoretical concept. Yeah, so the idea is that, well, we've got the concept of a sentence, and we use public language. So we've got a bunch of people, we've got a bunch of apes saying a bunch of stuff, doing a bunch of stuff. And we want to come up with some theory to explain their behavior. And then the theory is well, in order to come up with a theory, we need some model. The model has got to be something that is already something we already are acquainted with. We're already acquainted with public language, and we've got the idea of a sentence. So then we can say, well, oh, there's a bear in the cave. Yeah, I say there's a bear in the cave. Why do I say that? What causes me? I've got the idea of causation. I want to have some theory about what causes people to say things and do things. And what causes the person to say it is there something like a sentence in their head that has the causal role of producing the statement. Yeah, and so this is the sort of myth. So he says we're approaching the times of the central episode of that myth. I want you to suppose that in this neo-Rileyan culture, there now appears a genius. Let us call him Jones. Yeah. Now, what does Jones do? Yeah, so in this section, he says, listen, the behaviorists think that all concepts must be built by explicit definition. So the behaviorists have the idea that everything needs to be introduced by explicit definition from a basic vocabulary pertaining to overt behavior. This is an austere program of concept formation. So we have explicit definitions. If we think that all definitions have got to be explicit, then we're going to have a problem. Now, because we're not going to be able to have any sort of novelty in our conceptual states. When we come to Kerry, her book on the origin of concepts, one of the things she's most interested in is the possibility of conceptual novelty and how we're able to develop new concepts. How we can, and I think part of it is we're able to develop concepts that can't be defined in terms of earlier concepts. And I take it the thought is that the only way you can get some real conceptual novelty is if you think that there's ways of introducing new concepts that aren't in terms of merely explicit definition. So the big limitation of behaviorism is the idea that all definitions must be explicit. What other sort of definitions are there? Well, there's sort of implicit definitions. You can define something in terms of the laws that govern it. And so when you introduce a concept as part of a scientific theory, you're sort of implicitly just defining it in terms of its role within the theory. Yeah, so so he says the behavioristic requirement that all concepts should be introduced in terms of a basic vocabulary pertaining to overt behavior is compatible with the idea that some behavioristic concepts are to be introduced as theoretical concepts. So he wants to say, yes, and I'm quite happy with behaviorism. I think when we introduce new vocabulary, we have to be able to explain its meaning. We've got to connect it to things that are observable, yeah?
the critical behaviorism of non-computational?
Yeah, so this is before computationalism, really. Yeah, so this is in some sense, it's not, he sees himself as sort of, yeah, this section is called methodological versus philosophical behaviorism. And so he takes it, philosophical behaviorism is tied to this austere idea that we have to start with explicit definition. He's quite happy with a methodological behaviorism, that we have to explain the meaning of our terms in a way that connects them to observables, to publicly observable things. I think, yeah, his position, I think, is compatible with a form of functionalism. I mean, once again, this is like 15, 20 years before kind of functionalism got on the agenda. So is this proto-functionalist? I think the role of models in one's theory, and so I think one thing is that I think the functionalists have a sort of view of science that is closer to the logical positivist. Is that it's all done through, first of all, you have the laws, and you're defining things in terms of their place in a set of laws. Yeah, I take it by thinking about the way models work in science. I think it's a bit cut off from a sort of that type of functionalism. Yeah, so the way in which we can use, and so like in classical functionalism, you don't have anything like analogical thinking. Yeah, but I think part of the way in which we can, I think when we think about models in science, that we're using an analogy. And so I think the classical functionalists have this idea that the meaning can be given purely in terms of a sort of set of rules or a set of laws. Yeah, so it's your place within this system of laws or rules. Whereas I think Sellers, by putting stress on the role that models play in theory construction, yeah, has a view of science that is a bit broader than I think the sort of view of the functionalists. Does that make sense? Yeah. But I think yeah. So this is now section 15. So it says we're now in a position to characterize the original Rileyan language, in which they describe themselves as there follows, as not only a behavioristic language, but a behavioristic language which is restricted to the non-theoretical vocabulary of behaviorist psychology. Now, suppose now that in the attempt to recount the fact that his fellow men behave intelligently, not only when their conduct is threaded on a string of overt verbal episodes, so maybe someone is giving you a running commentary of what they're doing. Yeah, like, I'm now going to do this, I'm now going to do this, I'm now going to do this. Now, so there you're like, oh, there's a correlation between the overt verbal episodes, what they're doing. After some time, they stop telling you, but they carry on behaving the same. Huh. That is to say, we should put it when they think out loud, but also when no detectable verbal output is present. Jones develops a theory according to which overt utterances are but the culmination of a process which begins with certain inner episodes. And let's suppose that his model of these episodes, which initiate the event that culminate in overt verbal behavior, is that of overt verbal behavior itself. So you've got this overt verbal behavior, and then you want to know what's the cause of this verbal behavior. And you say, well, there's something in their episode. And then you're say, what's this in their episode like? You're going to say, well, it's sort of like it's sort of like the overt verbal behavior. In what sense? Well, it has semantic properties. This is the sort of idea. Yeah, let's suppose that his model for these episodes, which initiate the events which culminate in overt verbal behavior, is that of overt verbal behavior itself. In other words, using the language of the model, the theory is to the effect that overt verbal behavior is the culmination of a process which begins with inner speech. Yeah, now, And the essential thing here is that what the model says, yeah, so one thing is that whenever you have a model, whenever you're using a model, you're using a model in science, you have a model and then you have commentary. Yeah, so he says, the second point to remember is that Jones's theory involves a model, it is not identical with it. So this is why I think he's not a sort of functionalist, because he's thinking of science in terms of models. When you have a model and then you have a commentary alongside the model, and it's always a bit messier. Yeah, there's a bit of mess. So he says, like all theories formulated in terms of model, it also includes a commentary on the model. A commentary which places more or less sharply drawn restrictions on the analogy between the theoretical entities and the entities of the model. That's why his theory talks of inner speech. The commentary hastens to add, but of course, the episodes in question are not the wagging of a hidden tongue. Now, you've got something like inner speech, but it's not like you've got a tongue inside your head. No, it's like inner speech, but there's no tongue involved. Yeah. So you're using outer speech as your model. And what's really essential about the model is that the sentences have semantic properties. And that's what's getting carried over to your theoretical entities. You've got these inner theoretical entities that have semantic properties. As built on the model of speech episode, it carries over to these inner episodes the applicability of semantic categories. So these inner episodes are things with semantic properties. So, and by semantic properties here, for those taking Uzzi's class, I guess semantic properties are going to be representational properties. That these inner episodes of representation. So how are we able to think of other minds as having representations? Well, here's the story. It's introduced as a theory. I think one way to like Sellers is a realist, that Churchland is an eliminist. I think it's a bad theory. Some people could be an instrumentalist. It's a theory, but we don't need to be committed to the entities that our theories posit. This is the position, and another one, someone influenced by quite a lot by Sellers was Richard Rorty. He has a view like this: you're just an instrumentalist about all of this stuff. You're not committed to any of the entities posited. Someone sort of in between is Dennett. I don't know if anyone's heard of Daniel Dennett. He has this idea of the intentional stance. Yeah, so belief attribution is a stance we can take towards things, and unalienable stance. Okay, I guess we've reached the end of the allotted time. Yeah, so I will see you tomorrow. And I think I've talked enough about Sellers. I think Sellers is sort of fun. The last thing in Sellers is the idea of self-reporting. Why not? Oh no, it's not, isn't it? Tuesday next week. Yeah, sorry, I'm just thinking next class. Next class. You look so kind of scared. It's like, Roger, no, not more. Okay, bye-bye. Oh, I didn't realize we'd gone.